Hello again. Night photography is probably the most requested technique of all from my subscribers. Beautiful scenes can be found at night, such as this shot I took at Niagara Falls, and capturing those images onto film or into memory is probably not as hard as you think it would be. So in this lesson, I'm going to take the mystery out of shooting scenes at night and show you how easy it is to get great night shots. There are two things you need to photograph scenes at night successfully: a camera with the capability of making manual exposure settings, and a good sturdy tripod. Before you begin your quest to shoot at night, make sure that you become familiar with your camera first. The last thing you want is to be outside in the dark fiddling around with your camera, trying to find out where everything is. In fact, this is the single greatest reason for bad pictures in the first place. You need to know your camera's features and how to make adjustments before you can begin to make great pictures. I always tell my students that going out to shoot with a camera you don't know how to operate is like getting behind the wheel of a car for the first time. You need to know how to operate the controls before you can begin to get started. Okay, so you have your camera. You're not sure what I mean by manual exposure capability or how to find those settings. I would suggest first that you read the manual that came with your camera. This will tell you where to find everything. If you don't have a manual, maybe I can get you started.
This is the mode dial on my Nikon D70. Let's see what these lettered settings mean.
M is for manual, A is for aperture priority, S is for shutter priority, and P is for program. I'll tell you briefly what these mean. M, which is manual, means that you can set the shutter speed and the aperture to any setting you want to. A, aperture priority, allows you to choose the aperture, and the camera will automatically select the shutter speed that gives you proper exposure at that aperture. S, and sometimes T on some dials, is shutter priority. This allows you to adjust the shutter speed, and the camera automatically selects the aperture that will give you proper exposure at that shutter speed. And finally, P is for program, where the camera selects both shutter speed and aperture. Okay? Now before we go any further, there's one thing I do want to bring up. If you have a digital camera, particularly a digital SLR, be sure to set your ISO, your film speed, to around 200. Okay, don't have it on auto ISO. That's very important for night photography.
You want to avoid excessive noise, or what looks like graininess, which occurs at higher ISO numbers. Auto ISO will inevitably result in a high number, so keeping it low at 200 or 400 will avoid this problem.
So you're going to choose the M setting, okay, and determine how to set your shutter speed, which is usually with a thumb wheel in the newer cameras. Once you've figured this out, click that thumb wheel toward the slower shutter speeds. In other words, go like say from 250 down to 125, 60, 30, 15, and so on. And at some point, you'll probably start seeing single numbers, such as 1, 2, 4, and then some quotes after them, which really mean seconds, like 2 seconds, 4 seconds, and so forth. Keep going down the dial until you get to the very end and hopefully find the B setting. The B, or bulb setting, allows you to keep the shutter open indefinitely. In other words, it will remain open as long as you keep the shutter release button pressed down, and then once you release it, the shutter closes. This is the setting you'll be using for your night photography. Now, we need to set the aperture. It's okay to select an aperture or f-stop and keep it on that setting throughout the shoot. I would choose f5.6. It's a good choice because it's a fairly wide aperture to let light in through the lens and will also give you fairly decent depth of field. By the way, if you have an older SLR camera, you'll usually find the shutter speed controls on that round knob on the top of the camera, and B will be near the end, probably at the very end. The aperture will be at the base of the lens barrel. Okay? So set that to 5.6. Now, grab your camera and your tripod and find the subject you want to shoot. Once you've found a good spot, attach your camera to the tripod firmly and compose your picture in the viewfinder or in the LCD. Once you have your scene composed, double check your exposure settings and get ready to shoot. You're going to bracket your exposures. which means selecting a variety of shutter speeds to ensure that you will get a properly exposed image.
However, bracketing is still a good idea even if you think you have a good exposure, because just the slightest change between more or less exposure can have a profound effect on how light is recorded at night. Longer exposures will give you more light in the shadow or dark areas, while shorter exposures will render more contrast between the light sources and the surroundings. Okay, so back to the shot. With your shutter speed on bulb, hold down the shutter in a smooth motion, count to 2 seconds, and release the shutter. Take a look at the shot if you have a digital camera. If it's too dark, increase the exposure by a stop and view the results. In other words, hold down the shutter for 4 seconds. If the scene is too bright, halve the exposure by a stop by only holding down the shutter for a second. If you prefer not to use the bulb setting, you can simply use the incremental second exposure settings in the same way. If you're shooting film, continue to bracket by one-stop increments on either side of 2 seconds to ensure good results. You really can't shoot too much, and your odds will increase with the more exposures you take. And that's all there is to it. Night photography opens the door to an exciting new world of photo opportunities, and with a little practice, you can easily master the art of capturing the world at night. If you have any night shots you'd like to share, why not post them on the Photography 101 Facebook site? We'd love to see them. Well, that's about it for this lesson. Until next time, goodbye.